The basketball world knew him simply as Shaq, but to corporate America, he was a one-man business empire. After hanging up his jersey in 2011, Shaquille O'Neal didn't fade into the background like many retired athletes. Instead, he became even more visible in American culture. Standing at 7'9" with a personality just as large, Shaq had always been more than just a basketball player. Even during his playing days, he dabbled in music, starred in movies, and showed up in commercials. But no one expected what came next. While most former NBA stars struggled to find their footing after retirement, Shaq was just getting started. He joined TNT's Inside the NBA and quickly became the show's heartbeat. His chemistry with Charles Barkley created TV gold, with their playful arguments becoming viral sensations almost weekly. Viewers couldn't get enough of Shaq's unfiltered takes and belly-shaking laughter. But television was just one piece of his growing empire. Behind the scenes, Shaq was building something much bigger. He owned over 155 Guys Burger restaurants, 17 Auntie Anne's pretzel shops, and dozens of fitness centers. He even became part owner of the Sacramento Kings, buying into the team that he once mockingly called the Sacramento Queens during his playing days. "I don't chase the money," Shaq often said in interviews. "I chase the fun, and the money follows." And follow it did. His net worth climbed well into the hundreds of millions. Unlike some athletes who blew their fortunes, Shaq studied business seriously. He even went back to school, earning his doctorate in education from Barry University. People did double takes seeing Dr. O'Neal on his business cards, but Shaq was dead serious about education. His face became unavoidable on TV. The General Insurance, Icy Hot, Papa John's, Carnival Cruise Line. Shaq pitched them all with his trademark humor. In one commercial, he squeezed his massive frame into a tiny car and grinned at the camera. In another, he danced around in a gold suit promising pain relief. Americans loved it. There was something about seeing this giant of a man having so much fun that made people smile. But not everyone appreciated Shaq's approach to his post-NBA life. Whispers in sports circles questioned whether a four-time NBA champion should be selling cream for backaches or dancing in commercials. Some old-school basketball purists thought it lacked dignity. They compared him unfavorably to Michael Jordan, who built his empire with a more serious public image. These criticisms mostly stayed in the background until a loud-mouthed sports reporter decided to make them his personal crusade. The reporter had built his career on controversial hot takes and saw Shaq as the perfect target. He started with supple digs during his daily sports show. "Is this really what we want from our basketball legends?" He'd ask his audience, "Selling us fast food and car insurance with silly dances. Whatever happened to dignity?" At first, Shaq seemed unbothered. He'd heard criticism his entire career about his free throws, his weight, his rap albums. This was nothing new. He kept building his businesses and enjoying life, posting videos of himself dancing with his kids or surprising fans at local restaurants. What Shaq didn't reveal publicly was how calculated his every move had been. Each commercial, each business deal was part of a larger strategy. While critics saw a clown, business insiders saw a genius who understood his brand perfectly. Shaq knew exactly what he was doing, and he was laughing all the way to the bank. The reporter's comments grew bolder with each passing week, moving from subtle criticism to outright mockery. He started doing impressions of Shaq's commercials on his show, exaggerating his movements and making fun of his catchphrases. The clips spread across social media, drawing both laughter and outrage. Shaq's friends urged him to respond, to defend himself against what was becoming a public roasting. But the big man just smiled and told them to wait. "When you're fishing," he told a close friend, "you don't go after the fish, you let the fish come to you." And just like in his playing days, Shaq was planning his move carefully, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The sports world buzzed with excitement every Thursday when Jason Whitlock's podcast aired. Known for his sharp tongue and even sharper opinions, Whitlock had built a career on saying what others wouldn't. His listeners tuned in not for balanced takes, but for verbal grenades thrown at the biggest names in sports. For 3 weeks straight, Shaq had become Whitlock's favorite target. What started as occasional jabs had grown into full segments dedicated to what Whitlock called the Shaq Sellout Tour. He played clips of Shaq's commercials, adding sarcastic commentary after each one. "Look at him," Whitlock said after playing Shaq's latest icy hot commercial. One of the most dominant centers in NBA history, reduced to rubbing cream on his back and making silly faces. Is this really the legacy he wants? Dancing for dollars instead of building something meaningful. His words stung because they touched on something deeply personal to many athletes. What happens when the cheering stops? How do you define yourself when you can no longer do the thing that made you famous? Clips from Whitlock's podcast spread like wildfire across Twitter and Instagram. Sports blogs picked up his quotes, running headlines like, "Has Shaq gone too far?" and "Whitlock questions O'Neal's post-NBA choices." The stories always included pictures of Shaq in his most ridiculous commercial poses, dressed as a genie, squeezed into a tiny car, or wearing a gold suit. Even some of Shaq's former teammates privately wondered if Whitlock had a point. Was one of basketball's most dominant forces diminishing his legacy with all these goofy ads? A few texted Shaq to check if he was okay, surprised by his silence on the matter. What they didn't know was that Shaq saw everything. Each morning, he scrolled through the comments while on his treadmill. He read every article and listened to every podcast clip. But rather than firing back immediately, he studied Whitlock's arguments, looking for the holes he knew were there. "He's building his brand by tearing down mine," Shaq told his business manager during a private meeting. But he doesn't have all the facts. Nobody does. The criticism reached a boiling point when Whitlock brought on a panel of former NBA players to discuss dignity in retirement. Though they never mentioned Shaq by name, the implications were clear, especially when they praised Michael Jordan's classier approach to business. "Some guys understand the power of scarcity," one panelist said. "Others just put their face on anything with a paycheck attached." The next day, Whitlock took his campaign to television. Appearing as a guest on First Take, he doubled down on his criticism, this time mentioning Shaq directly. "I respect what he did on the court," Whitlock said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "But come on, man. Shaq was one of the most dominant forces we've ever seen in sports. And now, he's hawking foot powder and pizza. It's sad to watch." The show's host pushed back slightly. "But he seems happy and he's making money. Isn't that what matters?" Whitlock shook his head. "Legacy matters. Dignity matters. Do you think Bill Russell would be doing the General Insurance commercials? Would Kareem be dancing around selling cruise tickets? There's a way to transition to business that maintains your stature." Shaq chose another path. The segment went viral within hours. Sports radio stations across America picked it up, turning it into the debate of the week. Was Shaq a shrewd businessman or a sellout? Through it all, Shaq remained publicly silent. No angry tweets, no Instagram responses, nothing. This unusual restraint only fueled more speculation. Was he hurt? Angry? Planning something? His TNT colleagues tried to get him to respond during their next broadcast, setting him up with a perfect opportunity to fire back at Whitlock. "You want to address some of the things being said about your business moves?" Charles Barkley asked on air. Shaq just smiled. "Not yet, Chuck. Some people talk because they want attention. I'll talk when I have something to say." Behind the scenes, however, Shaq was making moves. He called his publicist and asked for Whitlock's contact information, not to yell at him or threaten him. Shaq had something else in mind, something that would change the entire conversation. "Get him on the phone," Shaq said. "I think it's time we had a real talk about business, legacy, and respect." The studio lights burned hot as the 5 sports analysts took their seats for the live broadcast of The Final Word, one of the most watched sports shows in America. Jason Whitlock straightened his tie, knowing this was his moment. The show's producers had promised him 10 minutes to discuss what they were calling the state of sports legends in retirement. Whitlock knew exactly where he wanted to take the conversation. Millions of viewers tuned in that Tuesday night, most just looking for the usual sports banter. What they got instead was something else entirely. "Let's talk about our basketball icons and what happens after the final buzzer," the host began. "Jason, you've been vocal about this lately." Whitlock leaned forward, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I have, and for good reason. What we're seeing today is troubling. When I was growing up, our sports heroes had a certain dignity about them, even in retirement." The other panelists nodded, unaware of where he was heading. But now? Now we have Shaquille O'Neal, a four-time NBA champion, one of the most dominant centers ever, reduced to being a commercial clown. The host's eyebrows shot up. This was bolder than expected, even for Whitlock. That's pretty harsh, another analyst chimed in. Shaq seems to be doing well for himself. Is he though? Whitlock countered, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Let me show you something. The producers, who had been prepped beforehand, cut to a montage of Shaq's most ridiculous commercial moments. Shaq squeezing into a tiny car, Shaq dressed as a genie, Shaq dancing in a gold bodysuit for pain relief cream. When the camera returned to Whitlock, he was shaking his head sadly. Is this really what we want from our legends? Dancing for dollars? Then, to the shock of everyone in the studio, Whitlock stood up and began imitating Shaq's commercial dance moves, exaggerating each gesture to make it look more ridiculous. His impression was cruel but undeniably funny, causing uncomfortable laughter from his co-hosts. Get your icy hot. Get your Papa John's pizza. Whitlock mocked in a deep voice meant to sound like Shaq's. The general has the insurance deals just for you. One of the other analysts tried to redirect. But isn't there something to be said for someone who doesn't take themselves too seriously? Whitlock wasn't having it. There's not taking yourself seriously, and then there's turning yourself into a joke. Look at Michael Jordan or Magic Johnson. They built real business empires. They didn't plaster their faces on every product willing to cut a check. The segment continued for its full 10 minutes, with Whitlock dominating the conversation. By the time the host finally cut to commercial, the damage was done. Within minutes, clips of Whitlock's Shaq impression were spreading across every social platform. Whitlock just ended Shaq's whole career, one viral tweet read. Never thought I'd see someone mock Shaq to his face. Kinda, and live to tell about it, said another. The morning shows picked it up next day. Radio hosts debated whether Whitlock had gone too far or if he was just saying what everyone was thinking. Sports websites ran polls asking readers, is Shaq damaging his legacy with his commercial appearances? The basketball legend's phone buzzed nonstop with messages from friends and former teammates. You seeing this? Texted one old teammate. You gonna let him talk about you like that? Another message came from his business manager. We should issue a statement. This is getting out of hand. Even Shaq's mom called, concern evident in her voice. Baby, that man was very disrespectful to you on TV last night. What are you going to do about it? Shaq listened to her worry, then calmly replied, Mama, remember what you always taught me. When someone's trying to get you angry, that's when you need to be the calmest. After hanging up, Shaq sat alone in his home office, surrounded by his NBA trophies and business awards. The walls were lined with photos, Shaq with presidents, Shaq with business leaders, Shaq breaking backboards. His eyes settled on a framed quote his father had given him years ago. Excellence is not a singular act, but a habit. You are what you do repeatedly. Shaq picked up his phone and dialed a number. Hey, it's Shaq. I think it's time we invited Mr. Whitlock to have a real conversation. The world expected Shaq to explode. That's what celebrities did when publicly mocked, right? They'd fired angry tweets, posted emotional videos, or called into radio shows to defend themselves. But as hours turned into days, Shaq's social media remained oddly quiet. No angry posts, no defensive statements. Nothing but his usual content, funny videos with his kids, promotion for his charity work, and the occasional basketball commentary. This silence was so unlike the Shaq everyone knew, the larger-than-life personality who never backed down from a challenge. The man who had once threatened to murder Kobe Bryant on the court was now seemingly taking Whitlock's insults without a fight. Maybe Whitlock got to him, sports radio hosts speculated. Maybe Shaq knows he's right. They couldn't have been more wrong. Inside his Atlanta mansion, Shaq was in full strategic mode. The home theater had been converted into a war room of sorts. Spread across a large table were financial reports, business portfolios, and charitable foundation documents. His business manager, publicist, and attorney sat around him, working phones and laptops. Get me the exact figures on how many jobs we've created through the restaurant franchises, Shaq instructed his business manager. And I want the scholarship numbers from the foundation, not just totals, but stories. real kids whose lives we've changed. To his attorney, he said, "Pull together the ownership documents for all the major investments. I want to show equity stakes, not just endorsement deals." Shaq's publicist looked concerned. "Are you sure you want to reveal all this? You've always kept your business details private." Shaq nodded slowly. "Sometimes you need to show your cards, not because you're desperate, but because you're tired of people underestimating your hand." For years, Shaq had deliberately cultivated his public image as a lovable goofball. The commercials, the silly dances, the jokes, they were all part of the brand he had carefully built. What most people didn't see was the shrewd businessman behind the smile, the investor who had quietly built an empire while everyone was laughing at his icy hot commercials. That night, Shaq called his TNT colleagues to give them a heads up that he wouldn't be responding to Whitlock on their show. "No disrespect to you guys," he told Charles Barkley over the phone, "but this isn't about entertainment anymore. This is about respect." Charles understood immediately. "You're gonna go big, aren't you?" "I'm gonna go smart," Shaq replied. "There's a difference." The next morning, Shaq drove to his recording studio where he produced his podcast. The normally lively space was quiet and serious. Producers had been instructed to prepare for a special episode. No games, no celebrity guests, no typical Shaq antics. "We're going to record this, but hold it," Shaq told his podcast team. "It doesn't release until after I've had my conversation with Whitlock." For the next 3 hours, Shaq recorded what his producer later described as the most powerful thing I've ever heard him say. It wasn't angry or defensive. It was something more powerful. It was educational. Meanwhile, Shaq's publicist was working on the next phase of the plan. After dozens of calls, she finally got through to Whitlock's producer. "Shaq would like to invite Jason to appear on his podcast," she said, her voice professionally pleasant. "Not to argue, but to have a real conversation about athletes, business, and legacy." Whitlock's producer was stunned. "He wants to talk to Jason?" "After everything Jason said." "Especially after everything Jason said," she replied. "Shaq believes there's been a misunderstanding about his business approach. He thinks it would make for compelling content." The producer couldn't say yes fast enough. Whitlock appearing on Shaq's podcast would be ratings gold. Within the hour, the details were arranged. Whitlock would appear on the big podcast with Shaq the following week. That evening, Shaq sat on his back porch, looking out over his pool as the sun set. His phone buzzed with a text from his business manager. Whitlock confirmed for Wednesday. "You sure about this?" Shaq smiled to himself as he typed his response, 100%. Time to teach a lesson about judging a book by its cover. He put down his phone and took a deep breath. The stage was set. Now all he had to do was wait for his guest to arrive. Jason Whitlock arrived at Shaq's recording studio 15 minutes early, dressed in a crisp blue suit and looking confident. The security guard at the front desk noticed his hands fidgeting slightly as he signed the visitor log, the only visible sign that he might be nervous about facing the man he'd been mocking for weeks. "Mr. O'Neill will be with you shortly," the receptionist told him, gesturing toward a waiting area filled with framed jerseys and magazine covers featuring Shaq throughout his career. Whitlock sat down, his eyes scanning the walls. There were the expected basketball achievements: championship trophies, MVP awards, All-Star Game memorabilia. But mixed among them were business awards and honorary degrees that told a different story. Entrepreneur of the Year, Philanthropist Award, Doctor of Education, Barry University. Before he could take it all in, a door opened. Whitlock expected to see an assistant, but instead there stood Shaq himself, all 7'9" of him, dressed not in casual clothes, but in a perfectly tailored suit that made him look less like a former athlete and more like a Fortune 500 CEO. "Jason," Shaq said, extending his massive hand. "Thanks for coming. Follow me." Whitlock tried to read Shaq's face for signs of anger or resentment, but found none. The big man's expression was professional, almost friendly, but with none of the goofiness that characterized his public persona. Instead of leading Whitlock to the main recording studio where the podcast was normally produced, Shaq brought him to a smaller conference room. Inside, there was no podcast equipment, just a simple table with 2 chairs, a pitcher of water, and 2 glasses. "I thought we were recording a podcast," Whitlock said, confusion evident in his voice. "We will," Shaq replied calmly. But I wanted to talk to you privately first. Just us, no cameras, no microphones, man to man." Whitlock nodded slowly, suddenly feeling like he'd walked into something very different from what he'd expected. He'd prepared for a heated debate, maybe even some yelling. This quiet, professional approach threw him off balance. "Have a seat," Shaq said, gesturing to the chair across from him. As they both sat down, the chair creaked slightly under Shaq's weight. "Before we go on air, I wanted to ask you something. Why'd you do it?" "Do what exactly?" Whitlock asked, though he knew perfectly well what Shaq meant. "The mockery. The dancing. Making me look like a clown on national TV." Shaq's voice wasn't angry, just curious. "You could have criticized my business choices without the theatrics." Whitlock shifted in his seat. "It makes for good content. People respond to it." "So it was just for clicks?" Shaq asked, pouring water into both glasses. "Nothing personal." "Look," Whitlock said, finding his footing again, "I stand by what I said. You're one of the greatest players ever. Don't you think these silly commercials diminish your legacy? Jordan built a shoe empire. Magic owns businesses. Code went into venture capital. And you're selling foot powder." A small smile played at the corner of Shaq's mouth. "That's what you think I'm doing? Am I wrong?" Shaq took a sip of water before answering. "Jason, did you research me before you started this campaign? Did you look into what I actually own versus what I just endorse?" Whitlock's hesitation answered the question. "I thought so," Shaq continued. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to walk into that studio and record the most listened to podcast episode of the year. You're going to ask me tough questions about my business choices, real questions, not mockery. And I'm going to answer them honestly. More honestly than I ever have in public." "And why would you do that?" Whitlock asked. "Because sometimes a teachable moment requires a good teacher." Shaq stood up, his frame dominating the small room. "I'm not mad at you, Jason, but I do think you owe your audience the full story, not just the funny clips and the hot takes." Whitlock stood too, suddenly aware that he might have miscalculated badly. "And if I don't like where this conversation goes? If I feel ambushed?" "You're free to walk out any time," Shaq said, opening the door. "But I don't think you will. Because deep down, I think you actually care about journalism, not just entertainment." The hallway to the main studio seemed longer than it should have. With each step, Whitlock felt less like the hunter and more like the hunted. By the time they reached the recording room, he was sweating slightly under his crisp suit. Shaq gestured to the recording booth. "After you." The red recording light blinked on, and the familiar intro music of the big podcast with Shaq played through the studio speakers. Whitlock adjusted his microphone nervously while Shaq sat perfectly still across from him, hands folded on the table. "Welcome to a special episode of the Big Podcast," Shaq began, his deep voice instantly recognizable to listeners. "Today, I've got Jason Whitlock joining me. Many of you have seen his comments about my career choices over the past few weeks. Rather than responding on social media, I thought we'd have a real conversation." Whitlock nodded, trying to appear confident. "I appreciate you having me on, Shaq. Not many people would invite their critics into their own house." "My mama raised me better than that," Shaq replied with a small smile. "So let's start with your main criticism. You think I'm cheapening my legacy with these commercials, right?" "I do," Whitlock said, finding his voice. "Someone of your stature in the game should be building something more substantial. The dancing, the silly ads, it feels beneath you." Shaq took a sip of water, his expression thoughtful. "Before I address that, let me ask you something. Do you know what my first business investment was back in 1992 when I was a rookie?" Whitlock shook his head. "Google," Shaq said simply. "I was one of the early investors. My financial advisor thought I was crazy. Why invest in some internet search company, he asked. But I saw the future." Whitlock blinked in surprise. This wasn't common knowledge. "After that came Apple. I bought it in before the iPod was even a thing. Then came Starbucks and later, a real estate portfolio that now includes over 150 properties across America." As Shaq spoke, his assistant quietly placed a folder on the table. Shaq opened it and slid several papers toward Whitlock. "These are ownership documents for my businesses, not endorsements, ownerships. I own 17 Auntie Anne's, 40 24-hour fitness centers, 155 Five Guys restaurants, 150 car washes, and a significant stake in the Sacramento Kings. Each of these businesses employs between 10 and 30 people. That's over 10,000 jobs created. Whitlock stared at the papers, his expression changing slowly as he processed what he was seeing. But the commercials, he began weakly. The commercials, Shaq interrupted gently, are just the tip of the iceberg. They're what the public sees. Behind them is a business strategy that's been in place since I was 20 years old. Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame making the studio feel smaller. Do you know why I chose the General Insurance as a partner? Because when my mom was struggling to insure our car when I was a kid, they were the only company that would give her a policy she could afford. The silly commercials I do for them have helped millions of working-class folks get affordable insurance. Whitlock was silent now, the confident critic suddenly at a loss for words. The icy hot partnership. That came after I actually used their products to manage pain during my playing days. The money I make from those ads funds my foundation, which has sent over 5,000 kids to college on full scholarships. Shaq's voice remained calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that the microphone couldn't capture. This wasn't anger, it was purpose. You mentioned Michael Jordan building a shoe empire. Did you know I deliberately went another route? When Reebok offered me a huge contract, I turned it down to create my own affordable shoe line that parents could actually buy for their kids without breaking the bank. Whitlock cleared his throat. I didn't know that. Most people don't, Shaq said, and that's partly on me. I've never felt the need to brag about the business side. I let the goofy commercials be the public face because they make people smile, and making people smile has value too. Shaq pulled out one more document, a spreadsheet showing charitable donations totaling millions of dollars. Every time you saw me dancing for dollars, this is where much of it went. Boys and girls clubs in underserved communities, scholarships for first-generation college students, funding for police community relations programs in cities across America. The studio fell silent for a moment. The only sound was the soft hum of the recording equipment. I don't dance for dollars, Jason, Shaq said quietly. I build generational wealth while having fun, and then I use that wealth to lift others up. Whitlock stayed at the papers spread before him, then looked up at Shaq with new eyes. For perhaps the first time in his broadcasting career, the outspoken critic was completely speechless. The red recording light continued to blink, capturing every second of the silence. The podcast episode dropped at exactly 6:00 a.m. Eastern Time. By noon, it had been downloaded over 2 million times, a record for sports podcasts. Clips spread across social media like wildfire, with the hashtag #ShaqTaught trending nationwide within hours. People who had never listened to a podcast before were downloading this one. Barbershops played it over their speakers. High school business teachers assigned it as homework. The conversation between Shaq and Whitlock had transcended sports and become a cultural moment. The most viral clip was the one where Whitlock finally found his voice again after being stunned into silence. I've been in this business for 20 years, he said on the recording, his voice uncharacteristically humble. And I don't think I've ever been so wrong about someone's approach to business. Shaq's response was what truly captured people's attention. It's not about being wrong, Jason. It's about understanding that there are many paths to success. The loud path isn't always the wrong path, and the quiet path isn't always the right one. What matters is the impact you have. Media outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. Sports networks replayed the audio alongside old clips of Whitlock mocking Shaq, creating a striking before and after contrast. Business channels invited financial experts to analyze Shaq's investment strategy. Morning shows debated whether other celebrities should follow his model of mixing fun with serious business. By evening, Whitlock himself appeared on ESPN, looking like a changed man. I've spent my career pointing fingers, he admitted to the host. But today, I got a masterclass in how to lead with facts instead of opinions. Shaquille O'Neal didn't just prove me wrong, he educated me. When asked if he felt ambushed, Whitlock shook his head. That's the amazing thing. He could have destroyed me, made me look like a fool. Instead, he invited me into a conversation. He showed receipts, not emotion. I came looking for clicks and found wisdom instead. The business world took notice too. Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The Shaq Strategy: Why Authenticity Trumps Perception." 3 Fortune 500 companies reached out to Shaq about joining their boards of directors. A major publishing house offered him a 7-figure deal for a business book. At a boys and girls club in his hometown of Newark, New Jersey, kids gathered around a TV to watch their hero speak at a hastily arranged press conference. They cheered as Shaq announced he would be doubling his scholarship fund, inspired by the conversation with Whitlock. Sometimes when people criticize you, the best response isn't to fight back. Shaq told the cameras, the rows of children seated behind him. It's to educate, to turn a negative into a teaching moment. One young boy raised his hand during the question period. "Mr. Shaq, are you mad at that man who made fun of you?" Shaq's face softened as he looked at the child. "Not at all, young man. In fact, I'm grateful to him. He gave me a chance to tell my story in a way I never had before. Sometimes your critics become your biggest opportunities." The boy nodded seriously, absorbing this lesson about handling conflict. 2 weeks after the podcast aired, applications to business schools across the country saw a noticeable uptick. Many applicants cited Shaq's business philosophy in their essays. College professors created case studies based on his approach to wealth building while maintaining authenticity. Phone calls between Shaq and Whitlock became a regular occurrence. What had started as a public conflict had transformed into an unlikely partnership. They announced a joint venture, a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs from underserved communities. From mockery to mentorship, one headline read. At the first event for their new program, hundreds of aspiring business owners filled an auditorium. Shaq and Whitlock took the stage together, the size difference between them still striking but no longer defining their relationship. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what success looked like, Whitlock told the crowd. I thought it had one face, one approach, one path. Shaq nodded beside him. And that's the biggest lesson in all of this. Success isn't about how others perceive you. It's about the impact you make and the legacy you build. The crowd rose to their feet in applause, not just for the basketball legend who had proven himself a business giant, but for the power of conversation to bridge divides and create understanding. As one attendee later posted online, "I came to learn about business. I left having learned about life."